Here is today's assignment, which is going to be taking notes. I'd like you to go to Schoology and look for the assignment storyboarding notes and open the storyboarding notes PDF. As you continue to listen to this video, I want you to fill out the notes sheet. So here we go. First of all, starting with storyboarding, everyone. I'm going to turn on a screen snapshot here so we can go, screen shade, so we can go through a section at a time. There we go. All right, so when we're working with starting projects in 3ds Max or any modeling software, we want to go through these 4 steps first. We want to storyboard, and storyboard is where we actually write out the different things that we want to have happen, both what do we want our object to look like, what do we want it to do as part of our scene, and how we might eventually move it, what materials will make it realistic, and finally what camera angles will also help us as we create our project. When we model, we are actually doing something called creating geometry in order to render. And that means we're going to be working with a lot of number-related data. If you remember, I mentioned that it's going to be super easy to work with metric versus standard US measurements with our objects, but we want them to all be exactly relevant size-wise compared to each other. Now, when we work with materials, what we're trying to do is give the surface of our objects the properties that make them realistic. We can create these from scratch, or we can import images that we use, and then we have to do a little modifying to make sure that they are accurate. We also want to make sure that we are interacting appropriately with our scene, and that's what the word writing means. We want our object to be relevant for the scene that it is in. Next, we look at lighting to make sure that that's accurate, and that can be really challenging. Sometimes the default lighting is perfect for our scenes. Other times we may want to look more to outdoor natural lighting for our scene, or we might want to create spotlights or direct lighting to highlight objects in our scene. From there, we move on to animation. Do you see the animation is the end result, but we don't start there. We have to make sure first that we start with our objects so that they are accurate for us. After that, we then work on the animation. The animation is sometimes as simple as just doing a span of our scene to look at everything up close that exists, or it's the actual movement of the objects that models how they would be used in a live scene. Now, after we complete our project, once we've animated it, we can save a render with just an individual scene, and we can actually set it to look like a photograph. We can make it a high resolution, a high def, high quality rendering, or we can render the scene itself if we've added some animation. That rendering process, depending on how complex our scene is, can take up to 10 minutes, or it can move on to hours. When you get to your final exam projects, you're going to find that when we set our rendering, we're going to set it to start at the end of class, and it's going to continue to run into the evening in the hopes that the whole process will be rendered, and we'll talk about that more. But just know that that can be a time-consuming part. Now, moving on to learn a little bit more about materials. Okay, this information is right on your notes sheet. Okay, we initially want to think of the surfaces that we are applying materials to be more or less flat. They don't have to be, because in the case of, say, a 3-dimensional box or a 3-dimensional sphere or a 3-dimensional teapot, obviously they are not flat. But when we're building materials, we try to think of them as being flat. And when we do that, we're learning about something called a surface normal. And what that means is we think of something called an angle of incidence, or a 90-degree line that's perpendicular to the surface as we're working with it. That is similar to the place object that we use where we want our object, if we're aligning objects, to move in relation to the edge of the object that we are attaching it to. The other thing we think about as part of the surface normal is how dense the material is that we are creating on our object, because depending on its density, it might reflect light or it might absorb light. And as we're working with 3ds Max, we want to make sure that we are creating a material that models the reflectivity of that particular object in real life. And we're going to be practicing lots of features where we learn how to do this. Now, this next section of information for you speaks to all the things that we keep in mind regarding our material. So first of all, its shape. We look at the shape of the object, and as we apply the material, we make sure that the material applies appropriately. For example, we don't want it to tile, which the settings in the material editor might do unless we go in and modify them. We also think about the color. Is it a solid color? Is it a pattern color? And we use that diffuse map. Do you remember when we practiced our material editor for the first time, and we made sure, first of all, that our material was a standard material, and then second, we went into that little box to the right of the diffuse map? Well, we're going to be using that a lot. So we're learning about these angle of incidences, which basically help us understand how dense our surface is for the correct light reflection. Okay. Then we're also going to be working with the diffuse map. This angle of incidence also helps us to control number 3, which is the reflectivity, so that that's accurate. We also look at texture. Is this a metal object? Is this a wood object? Is this a plastic object? Is this, what makes this object what it is? And then we'll be working with something called bump and hole maps, and you'll get very familiar with what a bump map is. Basically, a bump map in 3ds Max is what adds the appropriate texture to your object. And then from there, some of our objects, if they don't have texture, they might be transparent, such as maybe we have glass in our scene, or maybe we have plastic in our scene. Well, as we're looking at those, they don't have texture because they are see-through. And we can add, for example, glass or plastic to our objects and make them see-through, but they would also be reflective, wouldn't they? Because if you think about a window, if the sun shines on a window, we see some reflection from the outside of it. Think of a car's windshield, for example. Or if we're holding a plastic, even though it's empty, a plastic soda container, and we're out in the sunlight, depending on the angle of sun, there's going to be some reflectivity. So transparency also involves reflectivity, and we are able to change glossiness in 3ds Max to make it be as reflective or perhaps non-reflective as we want it to be. We have settings that we use between 1 and 0. A mirror would be, that's another form of glass, right? So that would reflect whatever is occurring in the scene, or we could make it be more of a faded where maybe it's see-through but it's not reflective. So when we use our material editor and our material shader, we're going to be talking about maps, and we're going to be creating maps. We're going to be creating layers as we build our materials, and each one of these layers is going to have its own settings in its map, and I'm going to show you how you can see that hierarchy or that list of maps, and how you can go in then to see the settings for each particular layer. There's 2 different kinds of maps. Procedural maps are the ones you will build, and bitmaps are the ones that we'll borrow. They are existing ones, and we do that a lot. Why recreate something? For example, when we create our phases of the moon, we're going to be using a bitmap image of the actual moon's surface that we apply to a sphere. But then we're going to take that bitmap and we're going to add procedural maps to it so that we can see the craters, we can see the depth, we can see the bumpiness of the moon's surface, and it will look realistic by the time that we're done. When we take a map and we add the procedures to it, or add procedural maps, so that we take that flat image and we add texture and depth to it, we will be adding noise or flaws to those maps, and we'll be using those terms as we work through it. So now the rest of your notes sheet moving forward includes some keyboard shortcuts. Okay, once again, a lot of these have been given to us as we've practiced the different little short tutorials where they give us those keyboard shortcuts. As I said to you, sometimes I have difficulty getting a keyboard shortcut to work, so I'm also going to show you where the toolbar button for that as it exists. Also this information moving forward then, if you will move on to the back side of your sheet, we'll have just a couple of things to fill in here. Just a little tip, and we'll practice this. If you've been working with a file and you want to start a new file, after we save the existing file, we're always going to reset. I'll show you where that is. That clears out all the memory that was assigned to your original file so that you can move forward with as much memory available, because that makes sense, doesn't it? With all the things we have going on with 3ds Max. Since it's a visual software, we want to always make as much memory available as we can. We will be using a lot of templates, and I'm going to show you where those exist. We're going to use the import feature. This here is just a reminder to you. We'll practice this, but I want you to keep these notes sheets as a reference for this entire semester, because some of this information will be helpful to you. We will have a quiz over this information, by the way, and I'd like to have this quiz on Friday of this week if possible. So but we'll make sure that we're prepared for that also. It's a short little 10-point quiz, so it's not long. Moving on to lighting now. We've already talked about this, how we have two different categories of lighting, and we are going to primarily use standard lighting for all of the lighting that we add to our scene. That basically means that we're looking at more natural lighting for our scenes, where we can make, once we create backgrounds, our scenes or something that reflects the light in addition to the objects in our scene, it's going to look a little bit more realistic. Okay, fluorescent lights actually qualify in this category, but if you think of it, it makes sense, because fluorescent lights are in the ceiling and they spread their light over a wide space in your scene. But we can think of it also in terms of the sun. Photometric lights are more like lighting like lamps, spotlights, lamp posts outside at night, where the light is more centered upon where it's coming from and it doesn't go very far. We're going to practice these, and I've given you the examples of the 3 different kinds of photometric or categories of photometric lights, but we'll practice these, but there's nothing to take notes on. I would always suggest adding lights in top view like we practiced in class, and then we'll be able to modify them through the Create tab to add intensity, decrease intensity, and I'll be showing you that. And you're able, through your Tools menu light lister, you can see through the menu option all of the different light options that exist. And finally, a daylight system. We're going to practice this also. A daylight system, as I said, models the sun, and you can choose your location and you can choose time of day. And so the daylight is set in the scene, and then it will model what's going on at that time of day. So obviously a noon sun is going to be more of a direct sun than an early morning sun or a late afternoon sun when through the Earth's orbit. And we'll practice previewing and rendering that daylight system so you can see what the difference look like. Okay. Finally, when we're working with images, and those would be the bitmap images that we are applying to our objects in our scene, I'm going to show you how we can choose cool options to make them look a little bit more photographic, and I'll be showing you that. Once again, all of these notes are yours to keep as references for the things we talk about. It's yours to add information to that you want to jot down that you're maybe using repeatedly but